Sanchia, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for taking us through the housekeeping, and good morning to you all. My name is Sanchia Alasia and I'm the Acting Director for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at London South Bank University. I'm really pleased that you have been able to join us this morning for our International Women's Day event. We've got a really interesting programme for you, which will go for the next 1.5 hours. So we're due to finish at about 1 o'clock. As many of you would have heard by now, the theme for this year's International Women's Day is Break the Bias. And the wording that supports this is really profound and thought-provoking. And I'm sure that many of us, since we've heard about this theme, have been thinking about what this might mean for us and what this might mean for organisations. Can we imagine a gender equal world, a world free of bias, of stereotypes, of discrimination, a world that's diverse, equitable and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated? And I think that together we can forge for women's equality, and collectively we can all break that bias. There was an article written by the LinkedIn Vice President of Global Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging, Rosanna, and she was talking about how we all have a part to play in supporting equality, not just for women, but for all marginalised groups. And she explained that business leaders, as well as individuals, have got to put in that work to examine and confront not only our personal biases, but the systemic bias, which is supported by institutional power and dominance. Because once we acknowledge that that exists, from there we can build on our actions and strive for change. And it shouldn't just fall to women and other underrepresented groups alone. It's not just down to us to solve the issues around diversity and inclusion. We do encourage our allies to stand up, to proactively build inclusion across our workplaces. Active allyship is a key driver to an inclusive culture. And I have certainly been thinking how I can be an active ally in supporting other women in their career progression. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with an International Women's Day quiz. So I'm going to ask Libby, who is our EDI administrator, to launch the quiz for us. If she can also share the link to the poll everywhere. So we'll just give her a second to do that. So if you look in the chat box, you will see a link. You can click this link on your phone, your iPad or your laptop. And if you click on that, it will take you to the poll everywhere. And Libby, I'm also going to ask you to share your screen so we can see the responses live as they come up. So we'll just give everybody a minute to click on that link. Oh, actually, I've got the word cloud first. Sorry. Should we do the word cloud first, Libby?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got a word cloud, and we just want you to click on that and either put in a word or a phrase that says, what does breaking the bias mean to you? Just be really interested to hear from our audience today what you think. So it can be a word, it can be a short sentence, but just let us know what you think. So we'll give you a minute. At the moment, we can see that everyone is coming up the biggest. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about that collective action. There's things that we can do as individuals, but also there's things that need to collectively happen in organisations to make sure that the bias is truly broken. Inclusive is coming up really big. Potential, unlocking that potential, no doubt. Okay. I'll just give it a few more seconds. Assumptions. And what are the assumptions and stereotypes that people have of us as women? Many, no doubt. Equity is coming up quite big, and we've got equitable, equality, so that's coming up quite a lot. Fairness. Opportunities come up a couple of times. And it's the equality of opportunity, but also that equality of outcome. So we've got to make sure that we give people the opportunity, but we've got to make sure our outcomes are also equitable as well. In the chat, we've got self-awareness and reflection, absolutely. What is it that you can do? Workforce diversity, absolutely, and particularly at the senior level. So what we tend to find is a lot of organizations will say, yes, we are diverse, we have 50% women, or we have 40% women, but at what levels of the organization do they sit? Do you have them sitting in your senior leadership teams, your executive teams, your boards? Okay, if we stop that now, Libby, that would be great. Thank you for sharing. And it just gives us a sense of what your feelings are, which is really useful for us. And we'll save this and we'll go back and take a look at this a bit later. And what we'll do now is we'll move on to our International Women's Day quiz. So is it the same link, Libby?
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully you will see that have popped up on your poll everywhere. We just have a few questions for you. It's just a bit of fun. We're not judging or anything like that. So how many Black women currently lead Fortune 500 companies? Is it 0, 2, 23 or 41? So put in, and it's all anonymous, so we cannot see how you're answering. So we don't know. Oh, they can't see the quiz. Okay, a little bit of a technical hitch there. Do you want to try to pop the link in the chat again, Libby?
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
Okay, it needs to be reloaded. If you maybe refresh the page, hopefully that will come up. I'm seeing some responses that are coming through now. So hopefully that is okay. Okay, reloading has worked. Excellent. So if you refresh the page, that should work. Okay, so most people seem to be saying 2. So if we stop it there, Libby. Yes, you're right. It's 2 of the 41 women, and it's only 41 women that lead Fortune 500 companies. Only 2 of those women are Black. Cassandra Brown Duckett and Rosalind Brewer. So yes, it is just the 2. Okay, if we could go on to the next question. So which of the following interview questions could reinforce problematic stereotypes about women in the workforce? How you would describe your interpersonal skills? What's your greatest strength? How do you balance work and family? And how does this position align with your career goals? Which one of those questions are problematic in your view? Dorota, if you refresh the page, hopefully that should work for you. Okay, we've got most people as putting how do you balance work and family? So if we stop the quiz there, yes. I think asking women how they balance work and family reinforces that stereotype that women are more likely to be caregivers and a perception that we're less committed to our career. So that is a problematic question indeed. Okay, if we could move to the next question. What is the broken rung phenomenon, if you've even heard of it? Gender disparities in promotion from entry level to managerial roles, women's likelihood to leave the workforce over to having children, the lack of female representation in senior roles, or all of the above? Okay, most people have put all of the above. Okay, glad to see that it's working for you now, Dorota. Excellent. Actually, the broken rung phenomenon is referring to the first one, gender disparities in promotion from entry level to managerial roles, because when women miss out on those early level career promotions, it then becomes more difficult for them to gain that experience to then move to the senior level roles. Okay, next question, please, Libby. Libby, are you okay to move on to the next question? Okay, we seem to be stuck. I'm not sure if she's hearing me. Libby? Okay, I'm not sure what's happening there. She might be having some connection issues, possibly. Yeah, which is always the way. No worries. Okay, what we'll do, if she's having connection issues, yes, she is, we'll pause it there. But I think from just the questions that we've gone through so far, we've learnt some interesting facts and figures there. And hopefully that gets your mind working, thinking, what is it that I can do? Or what is it that my organisation can do? So I think what we'll do now is we'll move on to our panel discussion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves briefly and what it is that they do, and talk about an inspirational role model in relation to gender equality that has made an impression on them. So I'm going to start off with Fiona McClement from Leeds Beckett University. Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi everyone, good morning. It's still morning. Great to have so many people at this event, and thank you very much, Sanchia, for inviting me. I'm very flattered. So I'm Fiona McClement. I'm currently Associate Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Leeds Beckett University. And prior to that, I was at University College for about 10 years as Director of EDI there. And I'm actually shortly leaving Leeds Beckett, and I'll be moving to Bradford University to work in their Centre for Inclusion and Diversity. And I just wanted to say before we get started that I'm sure, as all of you are here today, we're all thinking about the women in Ukraine at the moment as we are in this period around International Women's Day. And not only the women of Ukraine as well, but women across the world who are caught in war zones. So in Syria, Nigeria, Yemen, Ethiopia and South Sudan and Afghanistan as well. So I'm sure all of our thoughts are with those women at the moment. And in terms of the question of who is an inspiring role model to me, this isn't going to land well, but I'm going to really embarrass you, Sanchia, and say you. And so I don't know you that well at all, Sanchia. I think we've only met each other a few times, but I've known of you for a very long time, actually, from when I first started working at UCL. And you're a really big figure in the EDI world, and you're such a powerhouse as well in terms of all the work that you do. But it was really extraordinary to me to learn about all the other things that you do as well. So the fact that you were a former mayor. So I just think it's quite incredible, the amount of work that you do, all of which is based around really making things better for other people. And diversity work can be quite hard. It's a strange role to have, because in one sense you're working for the organisation, but in another sense you're working against the organisation. And there's always this kind of tension. So I feel sometimes that the diversity people within the organisation are not as appreciated perhaps as they are outside the organisation. So I'm really sorry to embarrass you, but I'm going to select you.
That is very touching. And I know we did some great work together in terms of dignity at work and bullying and harassment as well. We did some joint work that really had an impact at my other university that I was working at the time. So thank you, Fiona, and all the best for your new role. Really excited for you. Bradford are lucky to have you. Okay, I'll now ask Professor Eiman Aleem, the chair of our gender network, GenderNet, to introduce yourself, what it is that you do, and a role model.
Hi, Sanchia. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to be with you today, and for all our attendees. I am a professor of biomedical science at LSBU. I joined at the end of 2018 as an associate professor, and I was promoted to professor last year in April. And in addition to what I do on the academic level, I share the Gender Equality Network, as you just mentioned, since probably 2 years, if we count the COVID-19 year as a year. So regarding the inspirational role. So first of all, I think that bias is very much linked or often based to our ideas and the way of how we were raised. It goes back to childhood. This is how we build the unconscious bias. It's just embedded in us without realizing. So I think in this case, I would recognize my father as a role model in equality, as well as my grandmother. Why? Because I grew up my childhood was in the 70s, my teenager time in the 80s in Egypt. So I was born in Egypt, and this time, Egypt was not very advanced in equality. And the stereotype is that women are housewives and mothers, and men are the breadwinners and the educators and so on. My dad did not have this at all in the way he brought us. So not even my generation, his sister's generations, who were in their 20s and the 50s, for example, he was very adamant to let them go alone and study for PhDs and masters in America in the 50s. That was unheard of in Egypt. And so when it came to my generation, he did the same. He backed and supported me and guided me towards, education, traveling, getting to know the world. And this is the first role model for equality. The second one is my grandmother, because she raised me after my mom died during while she was giving birth to me. So my grandmother, there were 2 generation gaps, or 1 generation gap, so to speak. So she could have the old ideas of the old Egyptian ladies, for example. This was not the case at all. We were raised equally, boys and girls in the house. There is nothing called, you are the girl. I was the only girl. You shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that, or you clean the table after your brothers, as it is usually in the Middle East. Nothing was like this. So I grew up with these ideas embedded in me, and I apply it throughout my life. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Neil has just popped in the chat your inaugural lecture, which will take place later on in the year. It's open to the public as well, I believe. So do register and find out more about her very interesting research on cancer. Okay, I'm going to ask Jenny Garrett, OBE, to introduce yourself, what it is that you do, and a role model for you.
Thank you so much. And it's really great to be here. And Sanchia, I think we've known each other for about 10 years now, and I've never ceased to be amazed and impressed by what you do and the way in which you do it. Because it's not just what you do, it's the grace in which with which you do it that is wonderful. So thank you so much for being here, and you are absolutely an amazing role model. So as Sanchia said, my name is Jenny Garrett. I'm an award-winning career coach, author, and leadership trainer. My books so far have explored the empowerment of working women and women in leadership roles. I say so far because I'm writing another book at the moment, which should be out next year, which is more about racial justice in the workplace. Together with my team, we use our years of experience in coaching and leadership development to support women and those from ethnically diverse backgrounds to progress in the workplace, get through that broken rung that Sanchia mentioned in the quiz, as well as supporting majority group leaders to make inclusion happen. That's the main part of my business, but I also have a social enterprise called Rocking Your Teens, where we support 13 to 14-year-olds to increase their aspirations, be inspired, and make good choices. We ran an International Women's Day conference for them. We had over 300 young women attend from all over the UK, which was fabulous. And also about 18 months ago now, I set up the first directory in the UK for coaches from Black, Asian and minority backgrounds. So coaches that work in organizations that support senior leaders, that advance leadership. There, if you'd asked anyone 18 months ago to think of anyone, most of the time they'd come up saying, I don't think there are any from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So I set up a directory to showcase these coaches. And that's been amazing to see organizations diversify their coaching pool, give people a choice of who can be coached and who they can be coached by, and really shine a light on people. So that's the sort of thing that I'm really passionate about doing and absolutely love doing. In terms of who's a role model in terms of breaking the bias, there are so many people, and I absolutely start with my family. The first TEDx talk I did called Choose Joy was all about the journey of my grandmother and about her being the main earner in our family home many years ago. And my first book was about female breadwinners. So this idea of being the woman in the home who brings in the income, how you navigate work and life and family, it is really important to me and really resonates with Professor Eiman's story. But I actually will choose someone else on top of my family, and that's Tarana Burke, who you might be familiar with her name. She's the American activist who actually started the Me Too movement. So she was the first one to start the hashtag, to talk about women's experiences when it came to abuse and harassment in the media industry. She first tweeted about it and first shared, and it wasn't really taken on board until someone else did it, someone more famous, someone who wasn't a Black woman, who Elisa Milano actually then sort of reignited this hashtag. But I think it's really hard to speak truth to power. There's a saying, speak even though your voice shakes. And that's what it feels like when you speak truth to power, if anyone here has ever done it. And for her to start it was really important. And without her starting it, Elisa Milano wouldn't have been able to continue it. And there wouldn't be such change that's been happening in the media industry. So I would say she's a huge role model to speak up, to speak truth, to start, be an activist, and to move things forward for the good of everyone in society.
No, thank you. And I think that story really highlights the power of collective action and amplifying our voices to get a point or a cause across. So thank you. And I should also add, I don't know if you caught it when I said it earlier on, but Jenny is a trainer on the Aurora program. For those of us in higher education, we will know that Advanced HE run a leadership development program for women. And we're really happy that at LSBU, we're able to send delegates from LSBU on that. If anyone is online from LSBU and you're interested, do just drop the diversity team a line. Okay, Professor Deborah Johnston, over to you.
So thanks, Sanchia. So I'm Deborah Johnston. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor Academic Framework here at LSBU. No one ever knows what that means. I understand that completely. So that means I have responsibility to both lead on and reflect on our learning and teaching agenda, our strategic planning, and our corporate strategy. And I'm on the executive here at LSBU. I'm also a professor of development economics. My specialism was, so I see myself as a feminist political economist, and I worked for more than 25 years looking at gender in the labour market and gender with respect to well-being. So I was engaged in a range of studies looking at the way that women entered the labour market, and you know, the reasons for disadvantage in low and middle income countries, and crucially, you know, looking at the way that labour market interventions could or couldn't make a difference, and you know, what made interventions to improve the situation for women workers, what made them particularly effective. So that's my academic life, and in terms of my my role model, I'm going to choose someone that lots of people probably won't have heard of. It's a woman called she's a woman called Christine Simpson, and she is a trustee at the British Stammering Association, which is called Stammer. And I'll tell you why I'm choosing her. So I'm also a person who stammers. You may or may not hear it when I speak. I've had the fortune of being able to access a lot of speech therapy and public speaking training, but stammering is quite prevalent in the population. Between about 1% and 3% of the population stammer, but it's widely misunderstood. And a key source of support is our community organisation, and particularly the British Stammering Association. And I first began to engage with them about 20 years ago. Perhaps a little bit more actually, the 1990s, even longer, so a long time ago. And what I found when I first engaged is that I found a real gender difference. So there are about 4 men who stammer compared to women, so about 4-to-1 ratio. So women who stammer are a minority in a minority. And I used to go to stammering conferences and just find that my voice and my experience kind of wasn't well represented. It was really male dominated. And that meant that for some years I didn't really engage. And in contrast, the wonderful Christine had this very similar experience to me, but what she did was she started up particular groups for women who stammer. And she now has a group that is an international group. It's been very important in providing advice and support for women around the world who stammer. She is very engaged in ensuring that that voice then carries through into national organisations. And so she's been a really important voice for women who stammer, but she's done that crucially by creating spaces that women can talk about their experience. So she's gone into that very male dominated environment, and she's created a way that women who stammer can represent our concerns and our interests. And so she is my inspirational hero, not least because what she shows is that, you know, what are the things that you need to do to make change? How can you do that? And actually, how can you do that in a way that empowers not just yourself, but a range of women around you?
Thank you for sharing. And you've really highlighted the importance there of sometimes groups needing safe spaces. You know, needs are not always met in particular spaces, and so sometimes we do need to create those safe spaces for particular issues to be realised. And thank you, you know, you're quite a senior member at LSBU, and thank you for showing that vulnerable leadership, saying publicly that you have a stammer and allowing other people like myself to say I have endometriosis, allowing us to show our vulnerable side and saying that we might need support around that in order for us to be the best selves and best version of ourselves. So thank you, Deborah. Okay, so I'm going to ask a few questions to the panel, but what I'm going to ask the audience to do is if you have any questions, you can start using the Q&A box now. So do use the Q&A box to pop in your questions from now, and I can take those. But I just wanted to ask the panel, we had our word cloud at the beginning, asking the audience what bias meant to them, and I'd just be really interested to hear that from your perspective. And I'd like to start with you, Jenny, because if anyone's connected with Jenny on LinkedIn, she'll see that she's got 31 ways to break the bias, which I thought was really interesting, and there's some really interesting nuggets that are coming through there. So what does it mean to you, Jenny?
Yeah, I think it's, gosh, there's so much to say on it, maybe not one thing, but this idea of breaking the bias is so important for all of us, because the bias is what keeps us small. It stops us from being fully ourselves, fully productive, fully putting our full potential into the workplace, and really enjoying our lives. So I think understanding that this isn't just a little bit of bias, and it's not really unlocking bias or breaking the bias is not going to change the world. Actually, it really could change the world for us. It really could make workplaces so much happier, so much more productive, and so much more creative. I think it's important to know how important this is, first of all. But in terms of maybe one tip I could give, one of the tips I share is about flipping the kind of feedback that we get, because apparently women get so much more feedback on their personal style than men. 66% of us will get feedback on our style. Maybe we smile too much, or we don't smile enough, or we're a bit abrasive, or we're too emotional. All of this kind of feedback we get, in comparison to men, who only get about 1% of feedback on that personal style. So I really love a Twitter account called Man Who Has It All. And what he does is anything that's sort of said about women, he flips it. And it sounds absolutely ridiculous when it's said about men. So, you know, we don't ask men if they can have it all, but we ask women if they can have it all. And so I would suggest one of the ways we can break the bias in the workplace is just to flip the statements that we're going to say to women. Take a moment and think, if that sounds ridiculous when I say it to a man, then actually I shouldn't say it to a woman. And I think that's a really good way of just breaking our habits of behavior and starting to become more conscious of our bias, and then be able to do something about it. So flipping it is one thing we can do, but it's absolutely, all of these small actions can completely break the bias and change the way we experience the workplace.
No, thank you. Let's flip the script, absolutely. And it's interesting what you say about small actions. I was at a conference, the Advanced HE Annual Diversity Conference yesterday, and we had some medical students who were really taking some small actions around headgear, because in order to do the practice element of their 5-year degree, some of them weren't able to find caps that fit over their dreadlocks, over their turbans if they were Sikh, and they had come up with some really innovative ideas for inclusion around making that happen. And it seems like a small thing, but actually it's a really big thing, and it really makes a difference. Okay, Fiona, I'll come to you next. What does bias or breaking the bias mean to you?
Well, you mentioned systems bias at the beginning, and systemic bias, so it would be really interesting to get onto that discussion, I think, as well. But I guess I am thinking more about the personal bias, and I do much prefer the term implicit bias to unconscious bias. I do worry that when we talk about unconscious bias, one, there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of misunderstanding on what that actually means. But I think it gets people off the hook a little bit as well. Like, people will say, well, it's unconscious, you know, what can I do about it? But I think if we talk about implicit bias, I understand how that can be made explicit. And then I feel like there's a lot more around accountability. So people don't feel accountable if it's unconscious, but if we can make something explicit. And then there's a chapter of a book, it's been a Candola's book, called The Value of Difference. And there's a chapter in that book called The Old Boys Network. And it's just so good. I would just say, if you just ever read one thing, it's that chapter. It's just brilliant. And in that, he introduced me to the theory of social dominance theory. And social dominance theory is about how we have hierarchies in society. So society is stratified by gender, age, religion, race, for example. And it's these hierarchies create prejudice. And I really like this theory because it explains how we can have very sophisticated policies and procedures within organizations, and it doesn't make any difference because it comes down to social dominance theory. And this is about how the people who have the social dominance, so the ones at the top of the hierarchy, they quite like having that power. You know, they're going to guard against leakages of this power as much as they can. And even though that they might say they want to do diversity, it's quite nice being in that position of power. So people can say the most reasonable things and they can really look like they're wanting to do work around diversity. But actually, if you're in that socially dominant position, it's counter to your interest to actually really advance diversity. So I really like it as a theory. It's a very uncomfortable theory because I think where you sit in this hierarchy and will show your tacit support. So for example, if you're a white woman, it might be that, you know, that you feel that you're closer, higher up this hierarchy. And so it's a way in which sometimes it will be people will say the right thing, but not always do the right thing as well. So it's sort of relative to your position. So I just really like that as a theory. And it's something that always really helped me understand why we make so little progress and people say the right things, but don't often do the right things. And so it's not enough. In the same way, when we talk about race equality, it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. And I think it's the same, obviously, with sexism. It's not enough to just say, I'm not sexist. You have to be actively anti-sexist. And sometimes that means working against your own interests. You know, there's only so much power to go around. Sometimes that means giving up a bit of power. So that was a bit of a convoluted answer, but I think it's a really good inroads to understanding why we might understand a lot about bias, but we don't always make the progress that we want to see.
No, really interesting points. And I think action is the word. And certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has forced a lot of organizations to think about actions, because a lot of the things that were said following that are things that BME staff have been saying for a lot of years, but actually now is the time for action. Absolutely. And some real challenges about the things that we might need to do to make that action a reality. Eiman, can I come over to you? What does bias or breaking the bias mean to you?
Yeah, breaking the bias, actually, I like numbers. So if we just look from some numbers from the advanced HE about, I'm an academic, so I'm interested in numbers regarding professorships, and I get usually my information from advanced HE website. So we have actually 72.1 male professors in the UK and 27.9 female professors in the UK. And that's a huge gap. So like 50% more male professors. So I think there are so many reasons why this is the case, but I think one strategy could be to shed more light on, like in a way similar to decolonizing the curriculum, to shed more light on achievements, research achievements by females, for example. This is not, you know, most of our references and books are usually written by men, at least in the STEM subjects. So I'm coming from a STEM subject. And so one thing is to, as I mentioned, try to include as many references and books and work by women. The second thing also is to start very early, like the event we had sponsored by our Gender Equality Network and the EDI, when we hosted like 12 years old female. It was intersectional because it was female and BAME students as well. And how we kind of played with them DNA games and cell biology games and stuff to make them promote STEM education from a very early age. So I think they need to know, I mean, most of us, regardless of our backgrounds, that our brains work more or less the same. There is nothing called women are this, you know, like this stereotyping that women are more emotional, and so they would fit more in humanities and all languages and whatever, and they cannot do well in STEM. So this is something that we really need to break. This is coming from a STEM background, something I would like to empower women to break all these barriers and all these biases.
No, absolutely. And as you say, man, those figures are really quite stark, really very stark indeed. And there's a lot more work to do to improve that representation at the senior levels of universities and other organizations. So Deborah, over to you. What does bias or breaking the bias mean to you?
So I think a crucial thing, and I think I'm kind of echoing some of the points that colleagues might have made earlier, but I think for me, we understand bias really widely. Breaking the bias, I think we have to understand in terms of the evidence as well. So we know that bias is about experience. It isn't just about outcomes, but outcomes are crucially important. And I think breaking the bias means when we see outcomes that are equitable. And you know, I guess what the sort of focus I have on, and you're going to say that because I'm an economist, is, you know, the fact that that women are overrepresented among the poor. Women are overrepresented, for example, among poorer older people, because they tend to have, you know, less sources of pension and smaller pensions, for example. So how does that happen? And it happens because women are at that long-term disadvantage in terms of employment trajectories, in terms of pay levels. And so how would we know if we've broken the bias? Actually, when we stop seeing that. And so you know, the whole picture is important, but until that element can, you know, clearly be seen, until that, you know, overrepresentation of women among the poor has been eradicated, then we haven't met that goal. So I think that's, you know, I want to bring it to that point. And I think the second thing I'd wanted to say is something that Fiona said, and she said it much better than I did, which is the issue that, you know, we've got to understand that there are people, there are groups that benefit from the bias, and we will only overcome it if we understand that. And that might be groups that knowingly benefit or groups that unknowingly benefit, but we've got to start from that recognition. And it's only by, you know, realizing, you know, who benefits in the current constellation of power, that we'll understand how it is we can unpick it. And when we think about any of the aspects we've talked about, you know, the uncomfortable truth is that there are people that benefit from those bias systems, and bringing people on a journey with us means actually dealing with that uncomfortable positioning.
Absolutely, and there's conversations that need to be had, and we might need to be skilled and skilling people within our organizations to have those uncomfortable conversations. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the next question, but before I do, just reminding our audience, if you have any questions for our panel, you can start popping them in the question and answer box now. But what is it that you think that organizations or universities can do? We've heard that figure from Eiman, you know, only 27% female professors. What is it that organizations can do to increase diversity at the leadership level? And we've got a comment from Barbara in the chat, and it's interesting over the pandemic how a lot of people who were previously turned down for home working then proved that they could do their jobs from home. And I wonder if we could reflect on the pandemic. Do we think it's changed things for the long term? Personally, I'm not too sure. I feel that things are slowly going back to the way it was before. Barbara's asked in the chat, would flexible working make a difference? And it will be interesting to hear the panel's views on that. So what is it that organizations can do? Would flexible working make a difference? And has the pandemic made a difference, whether for the good or whether for the bad? So I'm going to start off with Fiona this time.
I think in terms of the pandemic, we don't know yet. I think there's advantages and I think there's disadvantages. So I think particularly some of the disadvantages might be around younger people and that need for informal mentorship that comes from being in the workplace, for example. So I think there's going to be advantages and disadvantages, but I think obviously things like flexible working can be really good. In terms of other things, I think organisations should be really doing. I think we need to be a lot bolder in taking equity-based approaches to supporting women. So I think many organisations are just still at the stage where they're just thinking about equality type approaches rather than equity-based approaches. And what would that look like? So just thinking about in higher education, for example, if we had an equity-based approach, would that mean then that we have to recognise that, you know, when women return from maternity leave, they need a lighter teaching load? And I know some universities do this a little bit, but how many of them are very bold and consistent in saying that we've got an equity-based approach that recognises we need to treat people differently according to their needs at different stages? And I'm thinking even in my university, we've got a very high turnover of women of colour academics. And I've been asking the question, you know, why women of colour academics leaving? And if we had an equity-based approach, we would put in place differential treatment, I think, to address that. We would say, you are, you know, you are valued, we will fight for you. And we might need to treat people differently to keep people, because I think, you know, people are an asset. So I just think things like these, if we had a framework in which we could take an equity-based approach, which showed why we had to do things differently. So it sounds obvious, but I think a lot of organisations don't do this. I think we should talk about sponsorship and not mentorship. So mentorship to me means that we have people who need to be developed, whereas sponsorship is saying, you don't need to be developed. We as an organisation need to remove all these obstacles that we put in your place. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot, just finally, is about alignment and having alignment with in organisations, because I think where we have real issues is when there's this cognitive dissonance between what an organisation says and then how it responds, and particularly in terms of leadership. So I think lack of personal alignment is when leaders say the right things, but their behaviour doesn't match their words. Lack of structural alignment. So this is when leaders don't follow their own policies and processes laid down by the organisation. And a really good example here is in obviously promotions procedures. How many times have we seen it in universities where there'll be an executive search firm brought in to appoint somebody, and we have a global search, and it turns out that that man who's already leading the faculty is the best person to be appointed to this very senior role. So we have policies that we don't really stick to, and obviously policies around bullying and harassment procedures as well. So this lack of structural alignment, and then lack of values alignment as well. So when the values of our leaders don't match those within the organisation, and I think this is really generational again, because I think young people, particularly in universities, are very values driven, and that seems to be out of sync sometimes with a lot of leaders. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and mission alignment as well. So when you've got leaders and the things that motivate them are not matched with those of their employees. So I think it's really, really important, and you can see the organisations that are doing this alignment well, and you can see the organisations that are not. And I think that's got really enormous consequences for how successful organisations are in terms of addressing inequity.
No, thank you for that. And it's really important that we have leaders who role model inclusive behaviours, and that should be a really important competency that we're assessing alongside, you know, strategy or quality assurance and the other things that we're looking for. And it's really important, as you say, about the values and the mission. Yes, we will have our own diversity strategy so that we can go into a bit more detail, but as part of the university or organisation corporate strategy, inclusion needs to really feature front and centre of those as well. So Jenny, what is it that organisations can do to improve on this issue?
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said at the first, which was around the COVID situation and how it impacted women. And I think it was a particularly tough time. You know, people talked about it being a wonderful leveler for everyone. Everyone's online, every situation is easy. It wasn't really. As we know, women often still do the lioness's share of the caring, whether that's elderly relatives or children or people in the community who they pop in to see. And that caring responsibility, which might have even looked like homeschooling, which was a full-time job alongside your full-time job, was, you know, that was really challenging for women. And women I've coached within the higher education particularly talked about the fact that the senior team was often male, often either older with grown-up children or someone else to be the main carer, and they carried on life exactly as it was. It was easier for them. But for women, it was really difficult, stressful, hard time. And I saw women opt out. You know, actually, I have to opt out of work because I've got the caring to do. And I believe it set a lot of women back. Additionally, what I find in higher education is the lack of flexibility and ability to be part-time at senior levels. When you ask the question, could I be part-time PVC? People look at you with blank stares most of the time, don't they? No one even considers this idea of job sharing, of working in a part-time way for these senior roles. And I think that does put women at a disadvantage. Even if you don't have caring responsibilities, you might want to work in a more flexible way and balance your life in a particular way. And I think that is difficult. So I think COVID-19 brought up the challenges that women experience, and I think it amplified them. In addition, what I heard from some people was actually, you know, in a more positive light, there's normally really bad behavior in our committee meetings, people speaking over each other, people being rude to each other. That wasn't really possible to do in the same way online. We had to start taking turns and putting our hand up and not speaking over each other. And I think it led to some more positive behaviors in how we communicate. But on the other hand, so I'm going back and forth here, I also heard from those with ethnically diverse backgrounds, there's often bias when people see me show up in the room. I've kept my camera off, so people are not judging me by how I look, but that is not a good thing. You know, they might feel more safe in order to do that, but if they do come back into the university environment, people still see them and know that they're a visible minority. So there have been pluses and minuses, and I do think that it's really important for institutions to think, what do we want to hold on to? The compassion that I saw through some leaders needs to be held on to. I don't think want to go back to the way we were in terms of how we led, but it's also important to think about the battle scars actually through getting COVID, getting through COVID, and how that might have how some of their colleagues might have experienced that, and actually still be in some way impacted by how difficult that experience was. So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of COVID-19 and its impact on women, and particularly the women with the intersection of identities, whether that's about parenting, whether that's about being from ethnically diverse background, whether that's about your sexual orientation. You know, what did that mean for you when you were the minority in the minority as well? So there's a lot to consider and unpack. But what can organizations do? Well, I think often what I hear is, you know, what are we supposed to do? We're at the top of this organization, we're white men, maybe, or a combination of white men and women. We cannot not be ourselves. You know, we shouldn't have to apologize for being ourselves either. And absolutely, none of us have chosen the body we have been born into. So it's then about what you do in that situation. And I think the first thing that there's a site or a group of people called White Men as Full Diversity Partners. And I think it's a really good website because it speaks to that issue you were talking about around social dominance. And one of the leaders of the organization says it's really important to use your power with humility. So you've got the power. You don't need to apologize for having it. You don't need to worry about losing it. But how can you use it humbly? And if I'm I'm in a position at the top of an institution in the UK, how can I use that humbly? Well, maybe what I do is I create a shadow board. Yeah, there's a board of people, but maybe I could create a diverse group of people, women, those from ethnically diverse backgrounds, those from the LGBTQ+ community, etc., those who identify as having a disability. And I bring them into the room so that we're not missing out, so we're not forgetting things when we're making our decisions, but also so that actually they are more aware of what happens in this room. And so we can develop that pipeline of leaders coming through, instead of going around saying, oh, well, everyone gets into this room on merit and there's no one, there's no one talented enough, there's no one, and would have to lower the bar. Well, absolutely, I mean, I think that's a ridiculous argument always anyway. But I also think if you succession plan, you can ensure that the future doesn't look like how the world looks now. So that would be one immediate thing that I think institutions can start to do. We need new voices, different voices in the room, and we need to really be thinking about how we nurture the pipeline of diverse talent through the organisation.
Thank you. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions. We've got some interesting questions coming in from our audience. So I'm going to ask Deborah and Eiman to comment on this next question. Dennis John has asked about how we can manage change. So how, you know, how do we get to the root cause of what the problem is, and how do we make sure we're not just bringing in change every 2 years, but we actually have a really proper culture change so that we can break that bias? So any thoughts on that, Deborah or Eiman? Maybe Deborah first, and then I'll ask Eiman to come in.
So thanks for that. And I think a crucial way so there are two things that I'd say about making really effective change. And the first is listening to the communities that you're trying to serve. So if we are doing work that's supposed to help women within LSBU, or supposed to help parents and carers within LSBU, speak to those groups, engage with them regularly, keep hearing them. So that's the number one. The second thing I'd say is, you know, look up and look out and look around. That there are organisations that have had really effective approaches and interventions to, you know, to support and promote different groups. And I think we've got a lot to learn from the organisations that have done that well. So I think it is really about, you know, continuing both as individuals and as an organisation to, you know, to listen and learn. It's as simple as that, but it's very easy for organisations to forget to do that. I think we go on particular tracks, don't we? We think we know what the answer is, and then we follow that through. So it's those it is those two things. It's listening to colleagues and learning from what's going on around us.
Yeah, that's really important. It's really important, as you say, Deborah, that we hear from the lived experiences of staff, because that will also go back to the mission, the strategy, the vision, the values. Is that landing? Is, you know, the things that we say we want to achieve, is that being felt on the ground? So that's really important. Eiman, any thoughts from you? How do we get real culture change and get to the root cause of what is causing bias and discrimination?
Well, I think it's, as you just mentioned, it's just, in simple words, apply what we were just talking about today. For example, I think that, well, I was involved in building a team from the scratch, the team of biomedical scientists at LSBU, and this was a very good opportunity to see how do we apply this diversity. And over the last 2 years, the team that I shortlisted and interviewed, and we finally hired, without really focusing on all the differences, but I found out when I'm analyzing our team, we are 5 different or 6 different people. We have 4 different ethnicities, age ranges from 32 to mid-50s. 80%, I think, are from the BAME community. So this is something that started and I think will grow, because it's just through our team, we are representing diversity to students, we are representing diversity to junior staff. We have Asians, we have Black, we have Middle Easterns, we have white. So I think that's a very good mini model that could be easily propagated. And there is, so it's just, when we do that, you know, somebody can say, okay, you targeted certain ethnicities or something. No, this is not true at all. All of them are very competitive. So I think listening, as Deborah said, and applying, and also providing, I would a little bit disagree with Fiona about sponsorship versus mentorship, because they're not mutually exclusive. So I think also providing mentorship to different staff in all what we were talking about will help a lot as well.
Yeah, I think both are useful, but I think yeah, as you say, we need to know the difference between the two, which is quite important. I'm going to come on to another question because they're sort of coming in thick and fast. Somebody, and I'm going to come to Fiona and Jenny about this. How do we include all women? So this person has said, you know, how do we include transgender women? I would exclude that to non-binary women, you know, disabled women, Black women, Asian women. How do we make sure that when we're talking about women, it's not just one type of woman, and that we are being as inclusive as we can? So I wonder, Jenny, if you could start, and then I'll come to Fiona.
Yeah, so I think with all of this, and just going back to your last point, this is about the fact that inclusion is not an add-on. Inclusion should be embedded in every single thing we do. And I think at the moment, it's like an afterthought. Have we put the inclusion lens on it? What haven't we thought about? But if this was just the way we did things, then then we'd make change happen. So I do think we need to be very conscious about always embedding inclusion in everything we do till it comes to the point where we wouldn't be thinking any other way. And in the same way, part of this is also getting that data. So I think there is a lack of data and information about the experience of the intersections of people's identities. So far, it has been most of the time women's experience, or you know, ethnically diverse people's experience, and we know that there's such a diversity within that. So I think we need data and information to understand what the inequity looks like, and we also need to listen, as has been said before, and then take action. But I think that's the starting point. What is the data telling us? Who is being more adversely disadvantaged? You know, who are the minority of women who really are behind the experience of other women, and those who identify as women, and in the same way who in other groups as well. You know, when we talk about ethnically diverse colleagues, gosh, you know, we're talking about so many different people. You know, even when you talk about black women, the experience of those with African heritage versus those with the Caribbean heritage is not the same, but we just say everyone's the same, and we give them the same experience and think that that's done. So it's about this idea of really personalizing and tailoring experience, which is actually something that you know a lot about in higher education, but it's about applying it not just to your students, but to some of your students, but to everyone, and understand and thinking about what that experience needs to be.
Yeah, thank you. And in relation to what we're doing at LSBU, we sort of recognise that we've got more work to do. We've started the work, but as I think one of the panelists mentioned, it's a continuing journey. We're currently working on our gender identity policy, but we also work very closely with our LGBT staff network to understand what the experience of trans women are and how specifically they want us as a university to support them. So again, hearing from that lived experience is really important. Fiona, any comments? How do we include more women in this conversation?
Yeah, I agree with Jenny that really good inclusion practice benefits everybody. So we do absolutely need to understand the experiences of people, but I think really good inclusion can work for everybody. I think it's very sad how polarised these issues have become in universities, in particular some universities, because when these issues are very polarised, it means we can't work towards solutions. And I feel like when it comes to this particular issue, there are solutions that we could work towards. So even if people, you know, there are people with certain views in certain universities, I feel like there are definitely things, practical things that people, if it wasn't so polarised and people were willing to listen to each other more, that we could definitely come up with solutions. that work for people. But I think it's really encouraging. I'm not sure where the person asking the question is coming from, if you're in higher education or not, but in higher education, we have Athena Swan, which is a gender equality charter, and that now includes trans. So it very much talks about, it's not about biological sex, it's about gender. And I think that's really fantastic and really positive. So all of the work that universities should be doing around Athena Swan, for example, which could be very practical, is very much trans inclusionary, which I think is a really positive thing.
Yeah, it's great to see how Athena Swan has evolved, and also encouraging universities to look at intersectional issues, which is really important. And LSBU does have an Athena Swan Bronze University Award, and we're working towards our departments getting theirs. Okay, the next question I'm going to direct at Deborah and Eiman, because Janice is kind of asking about promotion and progression in higher education for women, and how sometimes research is valued more than teaching and learning, but sometimes there could be a tendency to have more women in teaching and learning roles, which then means that their career progression can be hindered. So how can we, or what can universities do to value teaching and learning or pastoral roles, and value teaching and learning as much as research? So Eiman, I'll come over to you, because I know you've gone through a promotion process successfully, and it'd be good to hear from Deborah as Pro Vice Chancellor for Education.
So I start? Yeah, okay, so thank you, Sanchia. So actually, my own experience through promotion was the fact that actually teaching and learning has been acknowledged and recognized and awarded. So I'm not sure at LSBU. So I'm talking about my recent promotion at LSBU. I've been promoted elsewhere. Also, I had a professorship in a different university before, and that was more focused onto the research. So this is agreeing with what Janice wrote. But at LSBU, teaching is very much valued, and a big part of my success in the promotion was because of the new program I established, and the teaching and all this, in addition to some research. But I have to say that I think it was more on the teaching and side of what I do. So I'm not sure I can 100% agree. I mean, just talking about LSBU. I leave this to Deborah, please. Yeah.
Okay, Deborah, over to you.
So I'll pick this up now, and I think I want to get to the heart of the issue, which is that we know that in every career setting, some big generalizations here, is that women and other people that have less social power tend to be allocated activities and jobs that are valued less, and they tend to work harder, and they tend to do things that are either invisible or are seen as less valuable. And so I do understand where Janice is coming from, because I think if you look across higher education as a whole, I think you'd see several patterns that would generally hold, which is that, you know, women often are more involved in learning and teaching roles, might often have higher learning and teaching workloads, and might be particularly involved in doing things that are invisible and that are unvalued in many settings. And I think that, you know, to sort of get to the heart of the question, that will only change if we truly value teaching and learning in the same way that we value research, and particularly if we put a value on the things that are invisible. So that pastoral care of students, all of those activities around administration for courses, you know, those marking loads, all of those things that frankly, you know, very many academic colleagues might not see as prestigious, but are vital. And actually, we say they're really vital. We talk about, you know, so universities talk extensively about the importance of, you know, individualized student support, you know, that personal connection. Well, who's doing that work, and do they feel that they're getting valued? And so, you know, I'm really pleased to hear Eiman talk about her positive experience, and I would like to hope that everyone in LSBU feels that we value teaching and learning as much as we value research, and that actually and that we get even better over time at putting those invisible activities up there front and center. It's good for our students, it's good for us, and it would lead to greater equity, because we would be saying, actually, you know, these are things that are important. Thank you for doing them, and this is the benefit to your career because you've engaged in those things. And that's, I mean, that's it. It's putting a value on the invisible activities. And I think if we can do that, that would really fundamentally change the outcome for many women in higher education. So I know I've just generalized really broadly, but I think it was useful to get to the point, because I think that's the bit that very many of us would recognize as being an uncomfortable truth about higher education.
Thank you. And it's really good, important point you made, Deborah. We've got to value all of the activities that help make our universities run successfully. I'm going to come back to you, Deborah. I'm going to come back to all of our panelists for the final question. And it's, and somebody has actually asked this as well, and I was planning to ask it, what is it that organisations can do to close their gender pay gaps? The national gender pay gap in the UK is 15.4%. I know at LSBU it's lower than that, but there's still a gap. And so there is still a pay gap in many, many organisations. And it's not okay that that women are getting paid less than men. I know there's a pay gap day, isn't there? I think in November or something, where it's calculated that women are working for free for the rest of the year. How can we challenge organisations to do more, to do better, to really have those actions to close the gap? So I'll come to you first, Deborah, and ask all of our panelists to give their thoughts.
And so in terms of the actions that we're looking for, I think it's the range of things that we've talked about today. So both those concrete initiatives, but also I'm going to say the softer pieces, which is about creating new ways of hearing each other and working together. But at the heart of the day, what do I think will really change things? It's publishing our data, publishing it regularly, being held to account, having it visible to everybody. I think, you know, I really personally have seen the value of universities holding themselves to account in different areas. So it's publishing as much detail as we can, as often as we can, and letting people talk about it to us, with us, and being challenged on it. And that's having it all the way through. So having it in Board of Governors, having it in academic board, having it discussed in every school, in every group. Yeah, so I believe in the power of data and targets, you know, regularly being held up as one way that leads change.
No, absolutely. I mean, data can really help to shine a light on where the issues and the pinch points might be. It's important for us to be transparent and have those actions focused. Fiona, I'm going to come to you next. What can organisations do to close the gender pay gap?
I think we need to be more transparent about starting pay. So what salaries people come in on, because I suspect we say that we don't have an equal pay gap, but I suspect that men do come in on higher salaries. So within a grade, there might be, you know, 6 or 7 spine points within a grade, and I do suspect that men come in and that has a very cumulative effect. So I think much more transparency around the pay that people come in on. I think male allies and men asking for women to be paid more. So we know, you know, on the theme of bias, we know that when women are seen as self-promoting or asking for more money, they're actually penalised for that. So we say to women, you know, ask for more money, but actually so much research shows that they're then penalised for it. So we need men to be asking for the women that work for them to be paid more money. So male allies in this regard, I think. Looking at things like parental leave, shared parental leave, how many men in the organisation are taking that? Because if men are not taking that, then that means obviously that there's different working practices within the organisation, which could be contributing to the gender pay gap. So making sure that men are doing more of the caring responsibilities, and that would be reflected in uptake of these sorts of policies. And as Deborah mentioned at the beginning, you know, in terms of women being in lower paid roles, I think we talk a lot about higher earners when we talk about the gender pay gap and getting women into leadership roles, but I think we really need to be thinking about women on the lowest pay as well. So obviously things like paying the real living wage in organisations and really improving things for women on the lowest salaries. And finally, I would say having more job shares at senior level as well. So we've talked about part-time working and how part-time working can be a hindrance, but if we truly had viable job shares that we made work, that would create a lot more opportunities for women at senior level.
Yeah, thank you. Again, it goes back to that transparency element as well. Eiman, I'll come to you and then finish off with Jenny. What can organisations do to close the gender pay gap?
Yeah, that's actually a very important question. I think I cannot add more than what has been said before regarding transparency and actual evaluation of the real merit or CV of each person, regardless of where they their gender, for example. But also there is a bit on the individual. For example, women sometimes have tendency not to negotiate salaries as men do. And so I think there could be some training towards that as well. I was one of those women before in a previous position. I did not negotiate my salary, and I ended up being paid 50% of what my male colleagues were paid. And so the organization can say, well, you didn't negotiate a salary. So now I learned that I have to negotiate. Okay, I feel I deserve that much money if it is, you know, like a certain spine point or whatever. But it's not just on the individual, because even if the individual lacks this negotiation skills or doesn't know that they have to, especially if they're coming from another country, from overseas, they don't know what's the rules and the regulations in each country, then the organization should protect the individual from this bias and this gender pay gap. So it has to be like a policy at organizational level. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's negotiation skills which are important, but as you say, it's also incumbent on organisations to be transparent. If they know they're bringing in, you know, a head of service and they know what the other heads of service are being paid, they can also be proactive and say, actually, I'm going to benchmark your salary against what the others are being paid. And we know that people do that. Jenny, over to you. What can organisations do?
I think it's pretty much been said, actually, some really comprehensive answers. I think we need to not just think about the gender pay gap, but the ethnicity pay gap. So I think there's more than one gap to be considering. I think we need to understand what we're talking about, that sometimes it is about I'm doing the same role as you and not getting paid as much. And sometimes it's the gap is because actually there just aren't enough women in senior roles and the women are getting all of these lower paid roles. So, and a lot of this is around who do you imagine in this kind of role? Do we have a type here? And I think that's what we need to challenge. Is there a type of person who gets that management role, that PVC role, that whatever role it is? And is there a type of person who gets the administrator role or whatever the role is, or the teaching roles? And who's created this type? And how do we challenge that? So I think, this pay gap thing is about absolutely about transparency and openness, but it's also about what's not being said. Am I deciding that I don't give women so much money because they've probably got a husband at home who I think earns more money, which might not be true, who can support them? Or am I penalizing them because I think they're probably going to go off on maternity leave at some point and we'll be paying them and they won't even be around? So what is underneath these feelings of deciding to pay women less? So I think it's a mindset piece as well as an organizational piece that needs to be done.
No, thank you. And you raise an important point. Gender pay gap is obviously mandatory, but organizations can be proactive, like LSBU, and do an ethnicity pay gap, and we will be doing a disability pay gap, and then we're also going to look intersectionally, because I think if you look at the gender pay gap, for example, it will be interesting to see how much do Black women earn or Asian women earn compared to white women? And I think we need to get to that level of sophistication and detail. So thank you to our panel. We don't have any more time to take any more questions, but thank you to the audience for engaging and sending in your questions. Thank you to our wonderful panel, and I hope that you have been able to be inspired and also take away maybe something back to your organisation about how you can break the bias. So have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. Long may it last. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sanchia, and lovely to meet everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanchia.
Thank you.